r/nosleep. Posted by u/wildcardwildcherries. I'm volunteering at my old middle school. The job came with a very strange code of conduct. Part 2. I hadn't anticipated returning to FTS until my first day on Tuesday, but an email from Principal Lucas altered those expectations. I finished my morning shift at the hospital and was getting ready to go on a run when my phone went off. The email contained a brief greeting before questioning whether I could come in before my first shift. I reread the reason for this request a few times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. They wanted to know my mile time. In a sense, this would be my tryout for recess duty. They were really serious about that 8-minute time. Principal Lucas signed off with a "let me know" and his signature. I glanced at the large full-length mirror near my closet. My reflection stared back at me, wearing Nike leggings and a confused expression. I shrugged at the mirror. Why not? I was already dressed. I called the school, figuring it would be faster, and was directed to meet my former gym teacher near the church entrance. Mrs. Johnson was already waiting for me as I parked in the small church parking lot. She had barely aged. Her narrow 5'4" frame was unimpressive, but it was wrapped in muscles that were the exact opposite. As I approached, I noticed that the only indication of the years that had passed since I'd last seen her were a few pieces of silver now present in her otherwise inky black ponytail. "Well, haven't you gotten tall?" "Can't say I'm surprised, you always had those long legs." She pulled me in for a hug before I could do more than smile. "It looks like you're dressed and ready to go." "Perfect. We'll be using the biking trail right on the other side of the lot there." She gestured behind me to a stretch of pavement that was only briefly visible before it disappeared back into the trees. We traversed the parking lot as I answered all of her questions. Where am I living now? What was my degree in? How are my parents? All of that obligatory small talk. "You can start here." Mrs. Johnson stopped walking as we arrived at the running trail and pointed to where it continued into the forest. "Half a mile in, there will be a bright pink X spray painted on the pavement. Double back when you get to it and meet me right back here, where you started." I took off into the forest, chasing the echo of Mrs. Johnson's go. As it bounced between the large, ancient trees, I tried not to think of why my mile was being timed by my middle school gym teacher. That was the stuff of nightmares, and odds were, so was the reason this mile time is so important. I had a hard time believing I needed to be in such good shape just to keep up with the high-energy students. How did they come up with 8 minutes anyways? Could demons only run a mile in 9? I smiled to myself as the bright pink X entered my field of vision, and planted my shoe right in its center before bolting back the way I came. 7 minutes 6 seconds. Very impressive. Mrs. Johnson beamed at the stopwatch as I tried to conceal the fact that I was nearly dying. "You should have no problem with recess duty then. Come on in for some water." She led me back across the parking lot and inside through the church entrance, prattling on about which teachers were still there and which ones had retired. I nodded and offered polite responses as I admired the church wing. We passed through a naturally lit lobby, past the actual church area, and entered the long hallway I must have seen on the map. Mrs. Johnson tossed me a bottled water from the fridge in the office as she boasted my mile time. Lori frowned at her computer screen and muttered her congratulations, but Principal Lucas showed more enthusiasm. He offered me the task of supervising morning recess for the younger children, afternoon recess for the older ones, and miscellaneous tasks to fill my time between them. I agreed, staying to chat for an acceptable amount of time before seeing myself out. Aside from how seriously the mile time was taken, I started to feel less anxious about volunteering at FTS. By the time I arrived for my first volunteering shift this morning, the ominous code of conduct had all but left my mind. I stopped at the office this morning, where I was briefed on recess duty once more and provided with a whistle. As I suspected, the whistle was silver. It hung from a thick black string, allowing it to be worn around its user's neck. I dropped it over my head and pulled my hair out from under the string, suddenly recalling the various ways my former teachers carried their whistles. Mrs. Johnson had hers on one of those spiral cord things people sometimes put keys on. Her cord was red and she always wore it on her wrist. My 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Roller, wore hers on a heavy-looking silver chain around her neck. I made my way to the playground and waited for the kindergarten second graders to arrive. It was a decently sized group, probably about 50 kids total. It may not seem like much for the accumulation of 3 different classes, but when I was a student it wasn't unusual for one grade to have only 5 to 6 students. The morning recess passed without incident. It was strange to be the adult in charge in a place that made me feel like a child again, but I quickly got used to it. I escorted all of them inside after a successful head count, and was then directed to the middle school classroom to help grade algebra papers until lunch. I chose to sit with the middle schoolers at lunchtime. I remember when I was that age at FTS, a new staff member did that once. He was our new choir teacher, and he was younger than the other teachers, probably in his mid-20s. He sat at our table and engaged in the conversation like he was one of us. It really won us over. I became familiar with the current middle schoolers almost immediately. Their dynamic made me think of my own middle school class. There was Sophia, who was clearly one of the more popular students. She had long red hair and cracked a lot of jokes, making her friends laugh frequently. Then there was Jared. To my objective adult eyes, he clearly had a crush on Sophia, but to them he was the rambunctious class clown. There was Leah, who had bright pink braces and spoke loudly, and April, who was clearly the quiet one of the bunch. There were obviously many more, but I could only learn so many names in one lunch period. I expected the afternoon recess to pass much like the morning one had. This time, instead of pacing back and forth and watching the students play, I gave in to the middle schoolers begging and joined them in a game of capture the flag. You know the one. There are two teams who each have their respective flags, in this case a small rubber traffic cone, and their respective boundaries. Each team hides their flag and tags anyone from the other team who enters their territory to steal it. I won't go much more into detail because frankly it doesn't matter. All you need to understand is that there are flags that need to be hidden by the team captains. Jared was ours, and he immediately dipped into the forest to conceal our flag among the trees. We waited for him to return so that we could start the game, but he seemed to be taking a while to hide the flag. I could sense the mounting impatience of his classmates, so I wandered a few feet into the forest. Jared was soon visible, holding the traffic cone limply at his side and staring intently into the trees. "Jared?" I called, acutely aware that he was standing right next to one of the boundary trees. Its bright orange ribbon danced in the cold winter breeze. When he didn't answer, I approached him and touched his shoulder to get his attention. "My mom is out there," he said with a wavering voice. "I just saw her." I stood there silently for a minute as I tried to think of what to say. "Okay," was all that came out. Jared kept staring. "I think you should hide the flag so we can start," I told him. "You'll see your mom after school." Slow tears started to roll down Jared's cheeks, causing me to rethink my words. Was his mom dead or something? Why would he be seeing her in the forest if that was the case? I was struggling for another genius response when I saw her too. I glimpsed her only for a second as she moved swiftly through the trees, but a second was all I needed. She was easily 30 feet away from us, so she shouldn't have looked as tall as she did. What looked like a thin pink nightgown was all that protected her against the bitter winter air, and it hung limply against her gray-tinged skin. In the second she was visible, her head was hunched down into her shoulders as she peered sideways at us, smiling with impossibly sharp teeth. "Jared." My voice was low now, and I spoke quickly. Some memory gnawed at the edge of my mind again, but I didn't bother trying to identify it. "Jared, that's not your mom. We have to go." I reached for his shoulder again, but before my fingers could make contact, he bolted. "Jared!" I shouted before taking off after him. He ducked around the trees, pursuing the thing that was not his mother. "Jared! Jared! Jared!" My heart jumped and skipped several beats in my chest as voices that were not mine echoed around us. Some were childlike, others the panicked tone of a mother who had lost her child in a store or busy park. Jared stopped for a minute and craned his neck around, trying to find the source of the voices. His bewildered eyes met mine as I caught up to him. "Jared, honey. Come to mama." The thing sounded like a grown man speaking in a high-pitched tone, attempting to sound feminine. All the other sounds in the forest had ceased. No more wind pushed through the trees. It was a few feet ahead of us now, deeper into the forest. It hung on a tree branch from its knees, arms outstretched as if for a hug. Although its body was upside down, its face remained right side up, dirty clumps of brown hair hanging well past its chin. It grinned at Jared, showing those long sharp teeth again. It occurred to me that what I was seeing was not what Jared saw. He probably saw his mother, heard her voice, and longed for her presence. He turned back towards her and started to run again. But I was faster. I closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, grabbing his arm and twisting around to pull him onto my back. He tried to resist, punching me with his free hand, but I caught his fist and wrapped both arms securely around my neck. I didn't think about how heavy the 7th grade boy was, or how I myself made a scarecrow look chubby, nor did I pay any attention to the way he thrashed around and shouted for me to put him down. I just ran. As I picked up speed I heard the thing scream and drop from its tree. Jared stopped yelling. He wrapped his legs around my waist and gripped his hands together so that I could have both arms to run. He must have finally seen what I did. Faster, he whispered into my ear. The tears that shook his voice were no longer due to sadness, they were out of fear now. I thought about letting him down so he could run, but I wasn't sure if I could trust myself not to outpace him. I worried the adrenaline that saturated my body would convince me to leave him behind. So I carried him. The cold air bit my throat and chest as I sprinted around the trees. I could hear branches snapping behind us as not Jared's mom crashed through the forest. It sounded like the footfalls of a large dog, rather than those of something bipedal. I didn't need to look behind me to understand our situation. It was running on all fours, and it was getting closer. I pushed my legs to move faster, pumping my arms as hard as I could and trying not to trip over my own feet. The bright orange ribbon came into view, but Jared's whimpers at the thing's proximity kept me from feeling any type of relief. I ignored the burning in my lungs as I blew past the boundary tree. I caught the whistle that bounced wildly off my chest as I ran, and sacrificed precious breath to send 3 sharp screeches into the air. I sucked in another deep breath and blew 3 more, never slowing my sprint. We broke through the tree line and joined the rest of the students in running towards the church entrance. One of the 8th graders ripped open the heavy church door, and the steady onslaught of students kept it open. Only when warm air enveloped us did I stop running. Jared slid off my back when I entered the service area of the church, and I grabbed onto a pew for support. The rest of the students gathered around us as I struggled to catch my breath. "Jared," I wheezed. "Your mom seems like kind of a bee."